Ethan Carter, a 65-year-old retired engineer, had spent his life building a solid career before settling down with his wife, Charlotte, in a quiet Florida neighborhood. Their home was the reward for years of hard work, a place where they hoped to enjoy their golden years in peace. But just as Ethan thought he could finally relax, the Homeowners Association, HOA, made his life a living nightmare. From bizarre rules like banning certain flower colors to unexpected fee increases, the HOA seemed determined to control every little detail. Things escalated when Ethan received a formal warning letter demanding that he repaint his entire house because the color was no longer compliant with new HOA regulations. A rule that had been introduced only weeks earlier without any homeowner input. Ethan felt outraged. He had always followed the rules, but this was a step too far. If he didn't comply, he could face hefty fines or even a lien on his home. It was clear. If he didn't stand up to the HOA now, they would keep pushing. But what could one man do against such a powerful system? Ethan stared at the HOA letter in disbelief. Repaint the entire house? His home had been the same soft beige for over a decade, approved by the HOA when he first moved in. Now, out of nowhere, it was deemed non-compliant. And the worst part? The only acceptable colors were on a pre-approved list that required homeowners to use HOA-selected contractors at exorbitant prices. "This is ridiculous," Ethan muttered, tossing the letter onto the kitchen table. Charlotte, his wife, sighed. They've been getting worse every year. First, they fined the Millers for having a bird feeder. Then, they made Linda take down her porch swing. Now this? Ethan clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about paint. It was about control. Determined to fight back, Ethan attended the next HOA meeting, expecting a civil discussion. But what he found was a rigged system. The board members, led by Greg Thompson, a smug real estate developer, dismissed any objections with condescending smiles. "Our goal is to maintain property values," Greg said. "Compliance ensures the community remains desirable." "Desirable for who?" Ethan shot back. "You didn't ask homeowners about these changes." A murmur spread through the room. Other residents nodded, some whispering among themselves. Clearly, he wasn't the only one frustrated. Greg smirked. "The decision is final, Mr. Carter. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines. If unpaid, a lien will be placed on your property." Ethan's stomach dropped. A lien. That meant they could eventually force him to sell his home. Something inside him snapped. Enough was enough. He stood tall, scanning the room. "How many of you have had issues with the HOA? Unfair fines? New rules with no warning?" Hands went up, more than Ethan expected. HOA rules had become increasingly strict, and many were tired of it. Greg frowned. "If you have concerns, you can submit a formal complaint." Ethan let out a dry laugh. "Oh, like the complaints you ignore?" He turned back to the crowd. "We have rights as homeowners. We don't have to accept this." A wave of agreement spread across the room. Greg's smug expression faltered. For the first time, he looked nervous. That night, Ethan stayed up researching HOA laws. He discovered something shocking. The HOA had been violating Florida statutes by enforcing changes without a homeowner vote. If he could prove it, they could fight back. Ethan had started this battle alone, but now he wasn't alone anymore. It was time to take action. Ethan spent the next few days digging through Florida's HOA regulations, cross-referencing them with his community's bylaws. The more he read, the clearer it became. The HOA was overstepping its authority. They had been enforcing new rules without a majority homeowner vote, a direct violation of state law. Fueled by this discovery, Ethan called an emergency meeting with the frustrated homeowners from the last HOA gathering. They met in his backyard, nearly 30 people strong. "This isn't just about my house," Ethan said, holding up the warning letter. "They've been making up rules, raising fees, and threatening us with liens, all without our consent. We have a legal right to challenge them." Murmurs of agreement spread through the group. A woman named Linda spoke up. "They fined me $500 for having a garden gnome, and when I appealed, they ignored me. I got charged for having my trash can out an hour too early," another neighbor added. "This has to stop." Ethan took a deep breath. Now was the moment. "I spoke with a lawyer," he said. "If we gather enough homeowners, we can demand a vote to remove the HOA board entirely." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Remove the HOA board? It was risky, but possible. Before they could discuss further, bright headlights flooded Ethan's backyard. A black SUV rolled up, stopping just outside his fence. The driver's side door swung open, and out stepped Greg Thompson, the HOA president, flanked by 2 board members. "Evening, neighbors," Greg called out, his tone dripping with fake politeness. "Lovely gathering you've got here. Shame it's against HOA rules to hold unauthorized meetings." Ethan folded his arms. "You mean like the unauthorized rule changes you've been making?" Greg chuckled, shaking his head. Ethan, you don't want to do this. Fighting the HOA, that's a losing battle." He stepped closer. "Look, I'm a reasonable guy. If you just repaint your house, we can forget this ever happened." Ethan squared his shoulders. "I'm not backing down, and neither are they." He gestured toward the gathered homeowners. Greg's friendly mask cracked for a moment, replaced by irritation. "Then I guess you'll have to deal with the consequences." He turned to leave but paused. "Oh, and Ethan, your property is now under special review for further violations. I'd be careful." With that, Greg and his entourage drove off, leaving the group in stunned silence. Charlotte placed a hand on Ethan's arm. "What does special review mean?" Ethan exhaled. "It means they're going to come after me." But Ethan wasn't afraid. Greg had just made a mistake. He had shown his hand. And now, it was war. Ethan knew Greg wasn't bluffing. Within days, he received a barrage of violation notices. His mailbox was suddenly too large. His lawn was overgrown, despite being freshly mowed. His backyard shed, which had stood untouched for years, was now non-compliant, with a regulation he had never seen before. "They're trying to bury you in fines," Charlotte said, shaking her head as she sorted through the letters. "This is harassment." Ethan took a deep breath. He wasn't just fighting Greg anymore. He was fighting an entire system designed to break homeowners into submission. The HOA counted on people giving up, paying the fines, and staying quiet. But Ethan wasn't backing down. Determined, he started gathering evidence. He took photos of his property, documented every fine, and compared them to neighbors who had similar setups, but hadn't been cited. Greg was clearly targeting him. Then, something unexpected happened. An anonymous envelope appeared in Ethan's mailbox. No return address. Inside, there were printed emails between Greg and the HOA's treasurer. Ethan's eyes widened as he read. They were discussing illegal use of HOA funds. "Charlotte," he whispered, handing her the papers. "They're embezzling money." Charlotte's jaw dropped. "Oh my God, they've been raising fees to line their own pockets." It all made sense now. The absurd fines, the aggressive rule changes. Greg and his board, weren't just power-hungry, they were corrupt. That night, Ethan gathered his neighbors again. This time, more than 50 people showed up. Word had spread, and now the entire community wanted answers. "I have proof that Greg and the board have been illegally using HOA funds," Ethan announced, holding up the documents. Gasps filled the crowd. "We have everything we need to file an official complaint with the state." Linda, the woman who had been fined for a garden gnome, stepped forward. "Then let's do it. Let's take them down." The energy in the crowd shifted. Fear turned into determination. People who had once stayed silent were now ready to fight. But Ethan wasn't done. "There's one more thing. We have enough support to force a recall election. We can vote Greg and his board out, legally." A murmur of excitement ran through the group. This wasn't just about one man's battle anymore. This was about taking back their community. Ethan locked eyes with Charlotte. She gave him a proud nod. For the first time in weeks, he felt something new. Hope. Ethan wasted no time. With the evidence of corruption in hand and the growing support of his neighbors, he reached out to a local investigative journalist. If there was one thing Greg and his corrupt HOA board couldn't handle, it was public exposure. 2 days later, the headline hit the local news. Homeowners Association under fire for alleged corruption and harassment of residents. The article detailed everything: the unjust fines, the rule changes without homeowner votes, and most importantly, the evidence of embezzlement. It featured interviews with homeowners like Linda, who shared their experiences of being bullied and intimidated by the HOA. The story spread like wildfire. Within hours, the neighborhood was buzzing with conversations. Neighbors who had previously stayed silent now saw the truth. Homeowners from nearby communities began reaching out, sharing similar horror stories. HOA corruption wasn't just happening here. It was happening everywhere. Greg's response was swift. The HOA sent out a mass email calling the allegations baseless and accusing Ethan of spreading false, defamatory rumors. They painted him as a troublemaker, someone who was trying to destroy the very community he lived in. But it was too late. By the end of the day, Ethan had received more than twice the number of recall petition signatures needed to force a vote. Greg and his board were officially facing removal. That night, Ethan sat on his porch, sipping a cup of coffee, feeling the weight of it all. He had started this fight alone, but now the entire neighborhood stood with him. Charlotte sat beside him, placing a gentle hand on his. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. "You did what no one else dared to do." Ethan exhaled. It's not over yet, and he was right, because Greg wasn't going down without a fight. The next morning, as Ethan stepped out to grab the newspaper, he found a thick envelope stuffed into his mailbox. No HOA logo this time. This was legal paperwork. He tore it open, scanning the pages. His heart pounded. Greg was suing him for defamation. Charlotte rushed to his side. "What is it?" Ethan swallowed hard, handing her the papers. Greg just declared war. The lawsuit demanded an astronomical sum in damages, claiming Ethan had ruined Greg's reputation and caused irreparable harm to the HOA. It was a blatant intimidation tactic, meant to scare Ethan into backing down before the recall vote. For the first time in this battle, fear crept into Ethan's mind. "They're trying to bankrupt us," Charlotte whispered, her voice shaky. Ethan clenched his fists. Number Greg wanted him to break, to surrender out of fear. But Ethan had come too far. This wasn't just about him anymore. He grabbed his phone and called the journalist. "Tell your editor," he said. I have one more story for you. Ethan sat at his kitchen table. The lawsuit papers spread before him like a battlefield map. Greg had played his trump card. A lawsuit meant months, maybe years, of legal battles. It meant draining his savings, fighting against a system designed to silence people like him. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Was this worth it? Then, his phone buzzed. A new email. Subject, HOA lawsuit, we can help. It was from a well-known homeowners' rights attorney, Richard Dawson. Ethan read in shock as Dawson explained that he had seen the news story and had successfully taken down corrupt HOAs before. He was willing to represent Ethan pro bono. Charlotte gasped. Ethan, this is huge. This guy has won lawsuits against HOAs all over the state. Ethan exhaled, a newfound determination settling in. Greg thought he could crush him under legal pressure, but he had just made a fatal mistake. Ethan wasn't alone anymore. This battle had grown beyond one man. That night, at yet another community meeting, Ethan shared the news. I have legal representation, he announced. Greg is trying to silence us with lawsuits, but we're fighting back. We have rights. The crowd erupted in cheers. More homeowners than ever had gathered. People who had once been afraid now stood fired up and ready. But then something unexpected happened. A HOA board member, Karen Mitchell, stood up. She looked around nervously, then cleared her throat. I can't do this anymore, she stammered. I was told to sign off on those fines. I didn't even vote on half the rule changes. Greg controls everything. Gasps rippled through the group. Ethan took a step forward. Are you saying Greg has been running the HOA without the board's approval? Karen nodded, tears welling in her eyes. And he's been using HOA money for personal expenses. I have emails. A wave of shock hit the room. Greg's corruption wasn't just bad, it was criminal. Ethan's heart pounded. This was it, the smoking gun. Karen shakily handed over printed emails detailing misused funds, trips, dinners, even payments to a contractor for work that was never done. Thank you for coming forward, Ethan said firmly. This is what we needed. The very next morning, Ethan and several homeowners met with Dawson. The lawyer wasted no time. A lawsuit was officially filed against Greg. Later that night, as Ethan sat on his porch, a car pulled up. Greg stepped out, his face twisted with rage. You think you've won? Greg hissed. This neighborhood belongs to me. Ethan stood, his voice calm but firm. Not anymore. Greg's jaw tightened. For the first time, he looked afraid. Because for the first time, he wasn't in control. The recall vote was set for Saturday morning. It would be the moment of truth. Either Greg would be removed, or he would tighten his grip on the neighborhood forever. Ethan barely slept the night before. He had done everything possible, gathered evidence, secured legal support, and exposed Greg's corruption. But the vote would come down to the people. Would they stand up for themselves? By 9 a.m., the community center was packed. More than 80% of homeowners showed up, far more than Greg had expected. His usual smug confidence had vanished. The vote was called. One by one, residents cast their ballots. Ethan held his breath, watching as people who had once feared Greg now stood defiantly. When the final count was announced, the room exploded in cheers. Greg was officially removed. Ethan closed his eyes, exhaling the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They had won. Greg, however, wasn't done. His face turned red with fury. "This is a mistake!" he shouted. "You all need me. You think you can run this HOA without me?" Nobody responded. They weren't afraid of him anymore. A security officer approached Greg. "Sir, You need to leave. Greg opened his mouth to argue, but then his lawyer whispered something in his ear. Whatever it was, it drained the last bit of fight from him. He was finished. As he stormed out, the entire room erupted into applause. The reign of tyranny was over. The aftermath. With Greg gone, a new HOA board was elected, one made up of real homeowners who cared about the community. The absurd fines and rules? Gone. The shady financial dealings? Investigated. The lawsuit against Ethan? Dropped immediately. As for Greg? He didn't get away so easily. The financial records Karen provided led to a full investigation. Within months, he was charged with fraud and embezzlement. One evening, as Ethan and Charlotte sat on their porch, Linda walked up, smiling. "You did it, Ethan," she said. "You changed everything." Ethan shook his head. "We did it. I just lit the fire." She nodded. "Well, because of you, we finally have a community we can be proud of." Ethan looked around. The same neighborhood, but something felt different. Lighter, freer. For the first time since this battle began, he truly felt at home. Ethan's story is a reminder that power only exists when people allow it to. For years, Greg and the HOA had ruled through fear, using fines and intimidation to control the community. But once people stood together, that power crumbled. Too often, we assume that rules are absolute, that authority figures know best. But not all leadership is just. Some people use their positions for personal gain, and they rely on silence to keep their control. Ethan didn't start out as a fighter. He was just a retired engineer who wanted to enjoy his home. But when he saw injustice, he refused to look away. He spoke up, and his courage gave others the strength to do the same. The real victory wasn't just removing Greg. It was giving people their voices back. When communities unite, they can challenge corruption, demand fairness, and take back control of their own lives. HOA abuse is a real problem across the U.S. Every year, thousands of homeowners face unfair fines, illegal rule changes, and even threats of foreclosure from corrupt boards. But here's the truth. You have rights. If you're dealing with an overreaching HOA, remember, know your state's HOA laws. Many require homeowner votes for major changes. Gather your neighbors. One voice can be ignored. A group cannot. Document everything. Emails, fines, and violations can be used as legal evidence. Reach out to local news. Public exposure forces accountability. Use the recall process. HOA boards can be removed legally. Just like Ethan, you don't have to accept unfair treatment. When people stand together, they can reclaim their communities and their peace of mind. Have you or someone you know ever dealt with an unfair HOA? Share your experience in the comments. Would you like me to generate an SEO-optimized title and description for this video? Press 2 to continue. Blast off.